Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Cision webinar, The New PR, Integration Strategies That Work. I'm Heidi Sullivan, and we're really excited to have everyone with us today. A few housekeeping items before we get to the good stuff. For those of you who will be tweeting or would like to at least follow the conversation, we will be using the hashtag CisionWebinar, which you can see on all of the slides here for spelling purposes. We do want to make this as beneficial as possible for you, so please feel free to use the chat function in ReadyTalk to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we will try to answer them as we go as much as we can, and then hopefully we'll have a little time at the end to touch on any that we haven't gotten to yet. Lastly, for those of you who do like to take copious notes, please feel free to sit back, relax, have a little lunch. We will be sending out a copy of the presentation to everyone who registered after the webinar, so don't feel like you need to write down absolutely everything you see on the slides here today. So without further ado, just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Heidi Sullivan. I'm the Senior Vice President of Digital Content here at Cision. If you're tweeting me, I'm at HK Sully. And I am super excited today to co-host with Scott Livingston, Cision's SVP of Product Marketing. So welcome, Scott.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm happy to be here.
So to kick it off, Scott, I think we hear the buzz phrase integrated communications all the time, and it obviously is supposed to be, I need a great integrated campaign, and people are constantly putting out RFPs for a great integrated proposal. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. Can you tell us a little bit about what we really mean by integrated communications?
Sure. Well, I think when I think about this, I think about a couple of different big themes, right? So it's no surprise to anyone on the call that there are a variety of different channels and mediums to get our story and our message out into the world today, right? And integration means stepping back from all those choices and making a couple of strategic decisions. One is that your campaign or strategy should be reflective of all the channels that you have available to you, so that you should not have a social-specific strategy and a wire-specific strategy and a content marketing-specific strategy, that you should have a holistic strategy that really guides your choices about which channels to use, what stories and messages to put in those channels, and what your anticipated outcomes are from those activities. Now, just to be really clear, what I don't think we want to suggest is that you can create a piece of content and put it in 15 channels simultaneously. That's not an integrated strategy. And so when we say consistent strategy and messaging, what we mean is at a very high level, there's a consistency in the approach and in the valuation of each of those channels. Every channel has the ability to do something specific for a brand and its message, and so it's bringing those differences together under a single strategic vision and then leveraging each of those channels appropriately to meet specific objectives for, again, a particular campaign or overall media strategy.
Absolutely. So why is this all changing now?
Well, I think that, at least from my point of view, I think there's a couple of things that are changing, and Heidi, I'd put the ball back in your court to jump on to this as well. So, I think part of it is the shifting landscape and role between the PR professional, the marketing function within organizations, and the overall communication role more broadly, right? So we used to be in a world where the line between public relations and marketing was fairly clearly defined, and one was focused on earned media and one was focused on paid placement, and they were really trying to achieve very different things for their organizations. Many of the emerging channels that we have access to and utilize today actually blend earned, owned, and paid in very interesting ways and allow communications professionals direct engagement with audiences, for example, or real-time conversation. And so it's shifting the responsibilities and roles within organizations away from a more siloed approach of PR versus marketing into a much more integrated, there's that word again, integrated communication mechanism model that is really changing how companies think about who touches their brand internally, who's championing improving brand value and driving brand value for the organization.
Well, and I think not only is it the ever more powerful CMO that is driving some of this change, and not only is it social media that's driving some of this change, but increasingly between PR and marketing, there's a huge focus on content marketing. And so much of our campaign, so much of our strategy is focused around the content itself. And that's a PR pro's wheelhouse, right? I mean, we have owned the story historically. That is our sweet spot, and our expertise is to be able to own that story and own that content. And so largely as marketing shifts to a content-based strategy, that's where I think we really start to see more and more of this convergence as well.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And what's really interesting to me is marketing as a traditional function is shifting into that content-based orientation more and more, right? Because everyone's read the studies. People have a ever-increasing distrust of advertising. Younger generations don't even acknowledge advertising. Ad blockers are blocking ads across all sorts of channels and platforms. Like advertising is struggling, right? And so the marketing professional is shifting into the PR professional's wheelhouse, to borrow your language, Heidi. But at the same time, what I think marketing did very well in the late 90s and early 2000s was to begin to really leverage technology to improve the impact and measurement of their activities. And so while marketing is shifting from a strategic perspective into the content space, they're also bringing that technology lens, which the PR professional hasn't leveraged as heavily. And so I think it's a really interesting combination of changing roles and emphasis, as well as greater access to technology and budgets.
Yep, absolutely. So here's something that came out in 2012, which of course in this day and age is like 100 years ago. But this is from the Altimeter Group. Jeremiah Ouyang and Rebecca Lieb wrote The Converged Media Imperative. And even though it's from 2012, I highly recommend reading it. It's an interesting read. And it really talks about this shift that we're talking about and how our jobs and our day-to-day engagement has changed as PR and communications professionals. So what you see here, if I start in the top right hand, is really our content strategy. And again, this is a campaign, right? This is what we do as PR people. We come up with an idea of this is the message I'm trying to get out. Here's the content that I'm going to use to do it. As Scott mentioned, we publish it across channels. Again, it's integrated communications. You're not just sending the same tweet that you're putting on Facebook that you're sending out to journalists, that you're also writing on your blog. But again, that same message is being consistent across channels. And then the unique thing that we have access to is that you're engaging. And now we can actually hear back from our audience, from our community, and interact with them. When we find out what's really effective, we amplify that. When we find out what doesn't work, we restructure. We go back and report it to our boss, and we start all over again. I think what's most poignant on this slide is that right in the middle there is that we're actually listening and measuring and changing our message in real time, which is not something we've always had access to. So this is really a new workflow that's come out of integrated communications.
Well, I agree with you, Heidi. And one of the things that I like so much about this chart is, in many respects, the outer ring is very consistent with historical PR functions, right? So to your point, PR pros have always had content strategies. They've always had publication channels, fewer than they do today, but that's always existed, right? But new pieces are being added into the mix in the outer ring, and that emphasis in the center around real-time measurement and iteration really talks to the immediacy of feedback loops that we have, particularly through social channels today. And I think this chart does a really great job of balancing sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same, with this is actually really a new and different world for us. And I think the PR pros kind of, one foot in both of those at the moment.
Absolutely. So, let's take a step back. I think we've thrown a lot of terms out there and a lot of shifts. What this really comes down to is that PR needs a makeover. And you may say, I'm doing a great job at my job. I'm not sure why that is. Why is it that PR needs a makeover? So I think first we need to identify what are we really looking for here. why do we need to change? What needs to change to help us to become more successful? So I'm going to boil it down to some of the absolute basics. You can't have an audience without people. And we need to figure out who those people are. We need to engage them, and we need to have the right strategies with our communications that work. But we can't have effective marketing or PR if we can't reach those people. The problem is when we used to do PR in the very traditional way, we had a silver bullet, and that was the media. And we could say, if I can just get my message on the local 9 o'clock news, if I can just get mentioned in the New York Times, if I can just be covered in Vogue, then I'm going to reach those people that I need to reach. The problem is there is no more silver bullet. All audiences have been fractured. They are interacting with media in myriad ways, and there is not a single place that they can go. So we need to go and find these audiences in different places to begin to get our message. And that's really where we started to see integrated communications become more and more important. I mean, we've certainly seen on the broadcast side the fact that we have access to more stations and more channels and more shows than ever before, and we're accessing it not just on our TV or not just on our DVR, but we are going online in all different places. And then we look at traditional news media and magazines and newspapers, which have been steadily on a decline, the growth of blogs, the growth of news websites. There are just so many different places to find that content. It's become a huge challenge for us as PR professionals. So we're really shifting to this digital-first strategy. We've moved away from news as an event. So what I mean by news as an event is you no longer say, okay, I'm going to pick up the paper on my way to work in the morning and I'm going to read it on the train, and that's where I'm getting my news for the day. You don't say, honey, please stop doing the dishes. It's 9 p.m. We have to watch the news so we can get our news for the day. We're getting it all over the place on our smartphones throughout the day, whether it's from other people on Facebook or whether it's an email alert. It's all customized to us, aggregated, and in real time. So what that really comes down to is that we have to figure out how to hit those audiences. And I like to think of it in different circles. So, you know, Scott, please feel free to jump in here. But since this is my lovely mom, let's say in this first circle, I've got my mom. I've got the people at Cision that I work with. I've got some of my buddies. And when I have news to share, I guarantee you that these people are going to see it. And they're going to interact with it, and they're going to do stuff about it. They're going to share it with their friends. And then there's the second circle, and these are some of my fans. Again, you know, my mom shared it with her friends, and my coworker shared it with their friends. So those people started to see my news. My customers see my news. The biggest challenge is that there's this third circle of people who really, our news is relevant to them, our brand is relevant to them, but we don't even know who they are. We don't even know how to reach them, and that's really where this challenge comes from. Go ahead.
Sorry, Heidi. I was just going to say I think that's exactly right. And what's so powerful to me about the circle model is that it really starts to inform how we think about the messaging and how we craft the story for each of those circles, right? So the way that my family and colleagues interact with me and why they interact with me is very different than why my customers interact with me. And it requires different storytelling and different messaging, right? And then to get to the audience I don't know is yet another sort of strategy. And so back to sort of the comprehensive integrated strategy, you have to think about all those different facets, all those different stakeholders as you're crafting your messages and choosing your channels.
Absolutely. So these next few slides here, I'd actually like to introduce with an interesting question that Taylor just asked, which is a great point. Since there is no silver bullet, is there a tool out there to help search for our specific target audience? And I think the interesting shift is that instead of us finding our target audience, in a lot of ways we need to figure out how to be where they live. So to take a step back here, to actually find that audience, as we see here, Google has really increased the importance of original content when they determine how you appear in search. So the way that people find you right now, right, is they search for you. And we've talked about this the whole time. Make sure that you're SEO optimized. Make sure that you're at the top of the search rankings. And this is going to hold true for your social optimization as well, is if you have original content, something that's compelling, that's helpful, that is something that people can truly utilize, that's how they're going to find you and interact. And Google is actually going to say, hey, look, these people have some great stories that people are actually clicking on, that they're interacting with. We're going to raise them in our search rankings. It's not about jamming keywords into your press releases anymore. And then secondly, again, we were talking about 100 years ago from 2012. This is actually a quote from 2008 from the New York Times. But I think it really highlights exactly what we're talking about here. And this article was, if you remember, right around the presidential election, everybody freaking out because a study came out and it was, oh my God, young people are only getting their political news from Jon Stewart and The Daily Show. Then, of course, it turned out not to be true. And what Brian Stelter argued here is that this college student says, if the news is that important, it will find me. And that's really how we interact with news these days, is that we're waiting for the news to come to us because it's customized, aggregated, and in real time. And so, again, to your question, as we start to identify those audiences, inherently when we start to interact in a lot of these different mediums. So with the media, it's easy, right? Okay, if you're fashion and beauty, you're going to go for Vogue, and you're going to go for Pop Sugar, and you have like a very set list of what you're going to target. When it comes to social sites and blogs, and even on Google and in-person events, it's going to be a very similar concept. And this is something I think we can really learn from marketing with is, they do mixed media modeling and lookalike models. So if you look at the people you know, so again, my mom, my coworkers, my fans, my customers, the people that my mom knows, what do they have in common with my brand? What are their characteristics? What blogs are they going to? Where are they participating in conversation? And that's really the best way to identify those people you don't even know yet. So Scott, should we talk a little bit about buying decisions and that type of influence as well?
Absolutely. So Heidi on the last slide rather shared the quote, and I think it's a famous quote, and I think it's important for us to remember about the shift between traditional and social media. But it moves beyond just what is the delivery channel for me to consume news, and how do I prefer to do that, sort of as an event or as a continuous stream throughout the day. Social is continuing to change how people in all sorts of segments interact with and value brands. And one of the places where that's become the most apparent is around the purchasing decision. And so there have been many, many studies, and Dimensional Research did one, which is very good and very consistent with a lot of the other research out there, that said 90% of consumers today are influenced by online reviews as they're making purchasing decisions. More and more what's happening is people are being influenced by others that they think are similar to themselves rather than directly by the brand or by an advertising campaign. And how we assign credibility to different voices and how individuals like myself can influence me much more directly than sometimes direct communication from a brand is really telling in terms of the strategy you have to start to create about how you start to activate those influencers on your behalf.
Definitely. So one of the key strategies then becomes amplification.
Correct. So part of the question, and this was Taylor's, and Heidi referenced this a little earlier, is how do I find influencers, right? So once I know the community I want to activate, how do I do that? And there are a variety of different tools, from content marketing to direct social channels, but the strategy for all of them is to create an interesting piece of content, something that's informative, something that's entertaining, something that creates an emotional connection with an audience. And that's the kind of content that gets shared. And shared is a very generalized term in this kind of scenario. Could be shared through social media channels and other avenues. The amplification is the value point though, right? So the channel itself starts to create more engagement with your content because there is an initial set of influencers who are engaging with it. And so I may launch something and have 100 followers. Those followers, like what I've said, they retweet it out to their followers, and I've gone from 100 people reading my content to 10,000 people reading my content. And so part of the strategy in terms of how you tell your story is to think about what's going to resonate with your target audience, what actions you want them to take, and what are the right hooks, whether they be emotion, humor, information that you bury into and embed in your story so that it does start to get that sort of ripple effect and you end up with a community in that third ring, which Heidi referenced earlier in the presentation today.
Absolutely. So one amplification strategy that a lot of people focus on in PR is influencers. Again, this is another buzzword that's going around. And so why influencers? And I'll just kind of pop through some of the strategy really quickly. This is from Rohit Bhargava, the Influential Marketing blog. Great blog, great content, great resource for reading. But what he says is 1% of any population will be active content creators. That's a huge key, right? Those are the big guys. Those are the ones who are really actively doing things. 9% of that community is participating. They're commenting, they're sharing, they are creating some original thought around this. And that's just the very tip. There is another 90% that's simply consuming that content online, that are the lurkers. So I'm saying don't focus on that 1%, which tends to be one of our pitfalls with influencers, but that 10% of people who are really actively participating in the conversation. So in saying that, we talk about influencers, and I want to mention the hush puppy concept. If we go back a long ways, some of you probably read The Tipping Point. And one of the things Malcolm Gladwell talks about is in 1994, the brand Hush Puppies, the shoe brand, is struggling as a brand until all of a sudden a few New York City hipsters started wearing them out to the clubs and started to make them more popular. Then all of a sudden other people in New York started wearing them. And then the cool kids around the country started wearing them. And then the not so cool kids around the country started wearing them. And without any advertising, sales exploded by 5,000% in 2 years for Hush Puppies. So Gladwell argues, okay, oh my gosh, there are these influencers, these hipsters in New York who can choose to make something hugely influential. Now when I read this, I bought this hook, line, and sinker. I've always thought of my brother as one of these tastemakers that starts to be able to influence decisions. He has been obsessed with zombies long before zombies were ever a popular thing or before we ever heard of The Walking Dead. He gave me the Amy Winehouse CD before she ever made it to America. So he's always able to do that. The challenge was my brother never was actually interested in vampires, which was another trend. So it's very hard to start to identify that, to say who's the influencer that's going to help me do that. So on the flip side, there's this guy Duncan Watts, formerly with Yahoo, then with Microsoft, and a professor who did an online music download study. And he had 14,000 people rank 48 songs. For half of them, he said, okay, I'm going to let them all see how other people are ranking the songs. When they saw how other people were ranking the songs, there was a very clear number 1 and a very clear number 48, right? Because you don't want to be left out. If everybody else thinks number 1 is the best song, you don't want to say it's totally lame. And if everyone else thinks that number 48 is a terrible song, you don't want to say you think it's the best. Now, the other half of the people weren't allowed to see how anyone else ranked these songs. And not one song trickled to the top. Somebody's 48 was another person's 1. Some person's number 2 was another person's 47. So when provided with those group ranks, everybody followed the herd. So what we have here is kind of a disagreement. Malcolm Gladwell says the success of any of these social epidemics, any of these trends, anyone who says that I can help you go viral, it's heavily dependent on the involvement of a few of these influencers that have a particular and rare set of social gifts. And Duncan Watts says, absolutely no way. A rare bunch of cool people just don't have that power. When you test the way marketers say the world works, it totally falls apart. So who do we believe here? Well, both people. The point is they both still found that the trends began with a small few and are spread by those with the connection. The big challenge of that is that influencers can change over time and that absolutely anybody could be an influencer. It doesn't have to be my brother or some cool New York hipsters. But a general rule of thumb, as we start to go back to Taylor's question, is that influencers tend to talk to each other. So to identify influencers, we need to identify our tribe. And so this is really where it gets interesting. We used to have to target a travel magazine or a journalist that covers fashion or finance. And so from Cision's media database, when we used to just track broadcast newspaper, magazine, reporters, editors, producers, hosts, 75% of them covered one of our top 26 top-tier topics. So it's arts and entertainment, technology, business and finance. So they would say, I'm the fashion reporter, I'm the travel editor, I'm the education editor. Once we started adding bloggers and influencers, we found the exact opposite, where only 23% of those bloggers and influencers said, I cover automotive. Instead, they would say, I cover custom detailing of cars in California. I cover education policy. I cover vegan footwear or travel for people with disabilities. And so we really need to look at exactly who our audience is. So, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, and then I think the other place that gets really interesting is the audience and the story, if you think about sort of influencers and how you're going to engage with them, sort of changes over time as well. So Google's done a lot of really interesting research about the key channels that are used as an individual works through a purchase decision. And what's interesting is it really turns the classic PR marketing paradigm on its side as well. So in the classic world, right, marketing owned the sales funnel, PR sort of sat at the top and focused on brand, and marketing's role was really to drive people through the sales funnel into the purchase decision. But if you look at the channels that people use during their purchase evaluation and decision process, a lot of the channels they use and a lot of the information they're looking for is really driven by the types of information, types of stories, the types of communications that PR professionals excel at. So social, for example, is a huge element in the consideration part of the purchase decision. It doesn't drive awareness necessarily, but it certainly helps as you're starting to evaluate different alternatives and make sure that your brand is a contender for that purchase decision. Referrals and organic search, and Heidi mentioned how Google's really changed what organic search thinks about: original content, engaged content, socially shared content. All of that really fits into the intent to purchase and the purchase decision themselves. And so the role of the PR professional and the communities they need to activate is shifting as well as the sort of classic divide between PR and the marketing function starts to come together.
And then I think as we start to look at that, when we talk about everything coming together, we really need to start talking about metrics. So Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about cost center metrics versus profit center metrics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, these are two different types, right? And they produce different analyses as the names themselves talk about, right? So cost center metrics really focus on a department and talk about how much it spends to achieve an objective. Profit center metrics talk about the contribution that department makes to a brand or to an overall organization. Now, the challenge, I think, is that cost center metrics, frankly, are generally not the best ones any department should try to tie themselves to, because cost centers, by their very nature, are meant to be managed and frankly, often reduced, right? Profit centers are where organizations tend to provide better investment and opportunity. And so as a just general statement, one tends to want to have a profit center perspective rather than a cost center perspective. Cost center metrics are, unfortunately for a lot of us, the very easy things to count. They're the vanity metrics: number of likes, number of followers. They're the very easy numbers to be able to calculate quickly, put it into a report, and send it on its way. Profit center is much more complex, because you have to take a step back and really start to understand the impact and attribution that each of your campaigns has to the business's top and bottom line. And it requires additional tools and skill sets that really focus on awareness and on action, right? So how did you activate a community on behalf of your brand? What happened as a result of that? And those are the metrics that the PR pros of today and tomorrow are really going to start to gravitate to, because they will help reinforce the contributions they're making to their organizations.
Absolutely. So I'm going to pop a polling question up here as we start to take Q&A. Please feel free to fill it out. Now, I think we have time for one or two questions. I want to start with one from Stanzi, and this is actually from Twitter. Stanzi asks, integrated marketing is great, but what if, as an agency, for example, you don't have access to all the marketing funnels, just bits and pieces? And I do think that that's a huge challenge that PR pros face. I mean, it's great if you're sitting in a cube or a pod right next to the marketing team and you can say, well, let me talk to you about some attribution models and figure out how I can really prove my ROI here. Or I'm responsible for the blog, but you're responsible for social. Let's make sure that we get everything aligned. What I would encourage you to do is always talk to your client, if you're at an agency, with making sure that you're aligned with, say, the marketing agency, the ad agency, to really be able to support some of those campaigns as much as you can, and to always be open to those conversations. On the flip side, you're not always going to be able to do that, so look for any clues that you can begin to track. So let's say that you are responsible for the blog, or you're responsible for the blog post media relations, and you start to look at traffic and you see a spike in direct traffic or a spike in email campaigns directly after a great media placement or directly after a tweet-a-thon that you host. Make sure that you're using that attribution and saying, hey, the marketing team is thinking that this is an anomaly, but really let's look at some of the revenue or the leads or the traffic that we're driving based on some of the results that we're getting as communication pros. And then lastly, I think we have time for one more question. So Brad writes, is it true that greater weight is given to negative reviews rather than positive reviews? And Scott, I don't know if you have any opinions on this, but I think there's quite a few studies that argue that people, certainly, like I know if I'm looking for a pair of shoes, I don't really care if everybody thinks they're the greatest pair of shoes ever. I want to know if the three other people with wide feet think that they're super uncomfortable and way too narrow. The point is that when you start looking at reviews, the two things that we know as communicators is that, one, audiences can sniff out when someone is being blasphemous and false and really just atrocious, and when someone actually has true feedback. And then two, if we're responding in a very positive manner, if we're saying that we're listening and we're truly being an attentive brand, that's something that the audience really responds to as well. So as much as you have control over being able to engage with any sort of negative mentions and truly be able to start to change things or show that you're listening, that's something that your audience is really going to respect. I do see that we have quite a few great questions going in. So before we cut things off, we can maybe dive into a few of these. So Joan did ask, how is the influencer database different than the Cision list that shows the influence rating? There are quite a few differences with the influence database, from both an influencer search where you can start to look in real time at some of the conversations happening, to more in-depth profiles and details on some of the influence that different journalists have. So certainly answer the polling question, and we can definitely highlight some of that for you, or feel free to send me a tweet. Do we have time for one more question here? So David says, can you shed some light on the use of Twitter as a new PR media relations tactic in terms of altering specific journalists to one's news? Or alerting, sorry, not altering. So David, Cision actually does a State of the Media report and a social journalism study every single year, and we've been tracking journalist usage of social media. Now what we haven't seen is a gigantic spike in how PR people are actually interacting with journalists on Twitter. Interestingly, though, over 50% of journalists say that they're totally open to interacting with PR people on Twitter, that they're totally open to being contacted on Twitter. My best advice is to use social as a means to begin to develop some of those relationships. Those journalists are your influencers. And as you start to look at influence, you start to say, these are the people that I really want to contact and have an impact with. Those are the people that you can really begin to target and build relationships with on social. So Scott, unless you have anything else?
No, I thought that was a great answer.
Oh, thanks. I just want to thank everyone very much for tuning in today, and have a great day.